Hello, this is part 2 in a series of videos on notation and terminology in vibrational astrology, and we are talking about midpoint structures and the terminology involved. And what we're going to go over here is the meaning of direct midpoint structure and the meaning of indirect midpoint structure. So in VA, in vibrational astrology, we do not usually use the term direct midpoint structure. The reason we do not typically use it is because in vibrational astrology, the term midpoint structure and the term direct midpoint structure are identical. So we don't need the term direct midpoint structure, because direct midpoint structure means that the planet is the focal planet of the midpoint structure is directly on the midpoint axis. Okay, if you didn't follow the terminology I just stated, go back and watch part 1 in this series because I explain what midpoint axis is, etc. And focal planet. But now you know those terms, so I can use them. Let me say that again. A direct midpoint structure, that term, it's used a lot in other systems of astrology that rely on midpoints, means that the focal planet is directly on the midpoint axis. Very straightforward. It makes a lot of sense. It's direct. It's a straight on, boom. Planet is right on that axis. Well, that's the only midpoint structure that we typically interpret in vibrational astrology. So we don't need the term direct midpoint structure. Okay. And an indirect midpoint structure is when the planet makes some other aspect other than a conjunction or opposition to the midpoint. So let's look at this in the upper right corner. Here is a midpoint structure, a midpoint tree. A midpoint tree for Venus. Venus is the focal planet. And this is what a midpoint tree can look like in what's called cosmobiology, a system of astrology that relies heavily on midpoints and does use other aspects. So Venus is square the Moon-Neptune midpoint with a 23-minute orb. Of course, that's an indirect midpoint structure. So I put the indirect midpoint structures in this bluish tone and have this label indirect midpoint structures, and I put the direct midpoint structures in red. Very straightforward, very simple, so you can see what's going on, but just to go over each one of them very quickly. Venus is conjunct the Mercury-Mars midpoint in this particular birth chart with a 28-minute orb. Obviously, that's a direct midpoint structure. Do we interpret this in vibrational astrology? Venus at Mercury-Mars? Yes, because it's direct. I'm going to talk about whether we interpret the indirect ones in a moment. It's a tricky answer. You might think I'm going to say no, but it's a little more to it. I'll get to that in just a moment. But let's just finish this. Venus is semi-square the midpoint of Mercury and Jupiter with a 48-minute orb, and semi-square the Mars-Saturn midpoint with a 44-minute orb, and opposition to Jupiter-Saturn midpoint with a 1 degree 3-minute orb. So in vibrational astrology, we interpret only the 2 direct midpoint structures. We do not interpret the other 3, but in some other systems of astrology, they do. Of course, in most astrology, people don't interpret midpoints at all, okay? But in systems that do, they often interpret these other aspects. Now, do we interpret Venus semi-square the Mercury-Jupiter midpoint? Well, indirectly we might, okay? Let me tell you why we might. Because we will look at harmonic charts, or what we like to call vibrational charts. We'll look at the 8 vibration chart. In the 8 vibration chart, that Mercury-Jupiter is going to turn into a conjunction. So we will see this midpoint structure, Venus at Mercury-Jupiter, in the 8 vibration chart if it's within orb. But the orbs in the 8 vibration chart, we're going to use a 1.5 degree orb. If you're familiar with vibration charts, you know that in the 8 vibration chart, everything's expanded 8 times. So the orbs are expanded 8 times, And what's happening is in the natal chart, if Venus is semi-square the Mercury-Jupiter midpoint with an orb that's about 1/8 of a degree and a half, then we will end up interpreting it. Well, that got into a lot of arithmetic. Let me make it very simple. Very, very simple. You will see the Venus at the Mercury-Jupiter midpoint in the 8 vibration chart if the orb is very, very small. How small? We don't need to be too concerned about that. If you've studied the vibrational charts, and I have got dozens of videos on vibrational charts, and at least a half a dozen on the essence of what they are and how they work, then you know what I'm referring to. If you're not familiar with vibrational charts yet, then just know this, that a semi-square is a 1/8 aspect. We call it 8 vibration, and it turns into a conjunction in the 8 vibration chart. And so you will see these other aspects in vibrational charts. But the big difference is that we end up using smaller orbs than are used in, for example, cosmobiology for these other aspects. Okay, let me summarize. Point number 1, there are direct midpoint structures and indirect midpoint structures. However, in vibrational astrology, we only interpret direct midpoint structures, so we very rarely need the term, and we almost never use it. But if you hear it, you know what it is now. And sometimes people come into vibrational astrology, have a background in other systems. They may still use that language, and you may hear people using it in vibrational astrology because they're used to using this terminology. So you know why they're using it, even though we don't need the terms direct and indirect midpoint structure. In a lot of midpoint systems, they do not use vibrational charts. In vibrational astrology, we do. And these aspects that we are not interpreting will show up in the very important 8 vibration chart, which is in many ways like the most important fundamental first vibrational chart we often go to. These aspects used in cosmobiology will show up there if the orbs are very small. Okay. All right. So that's that terminology and how it relates to what we do in vibrational astrology. Now let's go over this. Well, I started talking about the word at, and let's talk about the equals, what equals means. So often when we're writing something, we use equals, and when we're speaking, we use at. It's just how it evolves. It's just, it's like tying your shoe. You don't even know what you're doing anymore. You just instinctively do it. A lot of people instinctively use this notation and terminology without even realizing that that's what's actually happening. So typically you will write equals. So in VA we can write Sun equals Mars / Jupiter. What does that mean? It indicates that the Sun is conjunct or opposition the midpoint of Mars and Jupiter. So in vibrational astrology, equals means conjunct or opposition. As you've already figured out, in other systems of astrology, like the cosmobiology, where they use other aspects, equals means any of those aspects. So equals means whatever aspects you use in your system. In the Iranian astrology, they use more aspects than are used in cosmobiology. So the equals includes all of the aspects. So equals means you have the midpoint structure, Sun equals Mars, Jupiter, and you're not bothering to distinguish which of the aspects it happens to be that you use. In VA, it's going to be a conjunction or opposition. And why do we use equals? Because there's very little difference in the meaning of a conjunction or opposition. So, because there's a little difference in the meaning, most of the meaning is in the planets and what vibration we're in. Sometimes we don't bother with it. Sometimes we don't even remember. Like, you might remember that somebody has a certain midpoint structure in their chart. You may not remember whether it was a conjunction or opposition, because it's relatively unimportant. And sometimes we use equals just because we don't want to throw in information that's distracting or not important or not relating to what we're focusing on or trying to explain to somebody. So we don't want to get distracted. For whatever reason, you can use equals. It's very handy. So on the bottom here, I have in red, it is common to write equals, right? Very simple. It's common to write Sun equals Mars, Jupiter, but more common to say Sun is at the Mars, Jupiter midpoint. You rarely hear people say his Sun equals the Mars, Jupiter midpoint. It kind of sounds weird. In fact, when I read, if I'm reading something, is that somebody wrote Sun equals Mars, Jupiter, sometimes I do not even, I'm thinking, I don't even say it that way. If I see Sun equals Mars, Jupiter, I will say it as Sun is at the Mars, Jupiter midpoint. So when I read this, I translate it to Sun is at the Mars, Jupiter midpoint. That's just what I do, and I think probably most astrologers do. But you can say the word equals if you want to. My point is simply this. You will typically see equals when you write things down, and when you're talking, you'll typically be using the word at. It's just instinctively natural to do. Okay, and because it's so instinctively natural to do, some of these things I've never really explained because I'm just used to it. Or when I get to writing it down, we learn that you can use equals. Never really explain that. We don't usually say that when we're talking. Anyway, we're just making explicit what we actually do with our notation, our terminology, our language. And actually, it should be all intuitive. People don't come up with these rules by deciding them all, consciously. I think a lot of it is just natural and instinctive. You want to write it down. It's handy to have this equals. I mean, you came up with the idea of equals because it's a handy notation. But when you speak, it's more natural to say at. Okay, now parentheses. Next thing, parentheses. This is something we use in vibrational astrology. I don't know if anybody uses it in other systems as much as we do in VA, but it's very standard in VA to use parentheses when we're describing planetary configurations where it's helpful to use them. And the parentheses do what parentheses always do. They hold things together. That's true in language. It's also true in mathematics. Parentheses just show that you're putting those things within parentheses together. Excuse me. Especially in mathematics, it's used all the time. So, for example, here's a note. If somebody writes, open parenthesis, Sun opposition Mars, close parenthesis, equals Sun/Jupiter. What does it mean? Open parenthesis, Sun opposition Jupiter, close parenthesis, equals Sun/Jupiter. Should be pretty obvious, right? It means that Sun is opposition Mars, putting parentheses around that because that's like one thing. Sun is opposition Mars, and that Sun opposition Mars is at the Sun-Jupiter midpoint. So it means that Sun is opposition Mars, and both planets are at the midpoint of Sun and Jupiter. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, what a terrible example. I used the Sun twice. Sorry. I should maybe make this slide over again. Well, it's okay. Let's say Moon opposition Mars equals Sun-Jupiter. So if Moon opposition Mars equals the Sun-Jupiter midpoint, it means that Moon is opposition Mars and both planets are at the Sun-Jupiter midpoint. Okay, so now when you have the parentheses and it just says Sun-Mars, here in this first example I have Sun opposition Mars in parentheses. In this second example over here, about in the middle of this paragraph, it's just Sun-Mars with no aspect. So if you see Sun-Mars equals some midpoint, I shouldn't be using the same planet twice. So if Sun Mars equals, Venus Jupiter midpoint, because there's no aspect, we're assuming conjunction. So typically, if there's not an aspect given, it means conjunction. It's the same as saying Sun conjunct Mars equals Sun Jupiter. And a lot of times we use these 3-letter abbreviations for everything. So conjunction can be CNJ. Sun conjunct Mars equals Sun Jupiter. Sometimes people will leave out the conjunction because it's just assumed. So if there's no aspect, you assume conjunction. Maybe some people are using it to mean conjunction or opposition when they leave it out. There's a little bit of ambiguity there. But I would recommend we leave the aspect out only if it's a conjunction or we don't know whether it's a conjunction or opposition. You might have to tell a little bit from context. But if you know it's opposition, I recommend you put it in there. Sun opposition Mars. Main point is this. Sometimes people will leave out the aspect, and then it is a little bit ambiguous what that means. Typically it means conjunction. It might mean conjunction or opposition. So, either always put the aspect in is a way to make it clear. What I do is I leave it out if it's a conjunction, if I'm kind of in a rush. We use this. Why would you be in such a rush? Because sometimes we use this terminology to make notes. You're making notes to yourself or making notes to someone of what's in a chart. And of course, you tend to use the glyphs rather than write it out. So, bottom line is this. Use the aspect glyph. Just make it clear to people, use it. But if you don't see the glyph, it probably means conjunction. It's a little ambiguous. It might mean conjunction or opposition. So just use the glyph and make it clear to people is what I recommend. So this notation allows us to compress a lot of information into an easily understandable and terse form, doesn't it? I mean, I didn't do it in glyphs here, but, Sun conjunct Mars in parentheses equals Sun/Jupiter. Very clear. You see exactly what's going on. What a stupid example. I should have said something like Sun conjunct Mars equals Moon Jupiter. By the way, that's all these planets should be different from each other. But I think you've got the idea. Okay. All right. Now, a little more terminology. We learned what a midpoint structure is. A planet conjunct or opposition, the midpoint of two other planets, is a midpoint structure. You'll very often hear vibrational astrologers say that there is a tight midpoint structure. What exactly does the word tight mean? The word tight means with a very small orb. So, and we use the term tight with midpoint structures and also with aspects. So you'll hear someone say, Joe has a tight Sun-Mars square. Has a tight Sun-Mars square. What does that mean? It's a quick way, an abbreviated way, a fast way of saying this. What you're actually saying is in Joe's birth chart, there is a Sun square Mars aspect with a very small orb. That's a lot longer and convoluted compared to just saying Joe has a tight Sun-Mars square. So when we say Joe has, that means the natal chart. It's what's implied. Tight means with a very small orb. So there you have it. So that's what tight means. And we can use it with midpoint structures. We can say Joe has a tight Sun conjunct Moon Neptune midpoint structure. So it means a very small orb. Now, how small? There's no specific cutoff point for what a tight aspect is or a tight midpoint structure is. But it means it's relatively small. We're not being specific. Some astrologers, we're going to use a little bit different orbs for what they're considering to be tight. But tight does mean small orb. What would be an example of a small orb? I would say if you have a midpoint structure with less than about a 20-minute orb, that's tight. Less than 15 or 20-minute orb. You have Sun conjunct the Moon Neptune midpoint with a less than a 15 or 20-minute orb, something in that range, that's tight. That's, and tight is a nice word to use because it specifically means small orb. If I say you have a strong sun conjunct moon Neptune, it's not quite as clear. Usually that means small orb as well, but it's not completely clear. Maybe there's some other reason why you think it's so strong. Tight means small orb. Very clear, very precise. Small orb. Okay. For say an aspect in a vibrational chart, like suppose you're in the 13 vibration chart, I would say an orb of, here I wrote 3 degrees. I'm thinking less than 2 degrees. Well, yeah, 3 degrees. Less than 2 or 3 degrees is about what most people would use. They would say it's a tight. Maybe some astrologers want to be like 1 to 2 at most. There's no specific cutoff point, but something in that 1 to 3 degree range we can call tight. Sometimes people say fairly tight. He has a fairly tight sun conjunct moon in the 13 vibration. That makes me think fairly tight. 2 to 4 degrees. I think this has never been discussed as far as I know exactly, but it's something like that, and it can also depend on what the context is. So really we can't define these things because we tend to use smaller orbs in compatibility and relocation, and there can be other things that influence what we're thinking of as tight or fairly tight orbs. These are terms you'll hear a lot. Okay, so it's not specific, but that's people use it a lot, and it is helpful. It's helpful to say Joe has a tight Sun-Mars square. Okay, very small orb. If I look at his chart and the orb is like 3 degrees, no. A square with a 3 degree orb is not tight in vibrational astrology. I'm not going to go into all the details of orbs in vibrational astrology, but if you know vibrational astrology, we use a 4 degree orb for squares. 3 degree orb is 3/4 of the way out. It's not tight. Definitely would have to be under a degree for a square to be considered to be tight. Conjunctions get much larger orbs, so tight would be a bigger orb. Okay, I think you've got the idea. Now you'll hear the term strong midpoint structure. Strong midpoint structure is not quite as specific and clear as tight midpoint structure. Tight means the orb is small. Strong usually means the same thing as tight. Usually it means small orb. So you say he has a strong sun square Mars. Means the orb is small. However, there could be additional reasons why that sun square Mars is strong. What if one of the planets is right on an angular house cusp? So you have Sun right on the 7th house cusp. Like right on, very, very tight. Square Mars. Well, that's making the Sun stronger, and therefore anything the Sun does is amplified in a way by being angular. So there can be other reasons why you think of an aspect as strong. Usually orb is the main one, but not necessarily. Okay. So when you hear somebody say it's a strong midpoint structure, probably they're referring to just the orb, but maybe there's something else working into it. It's not a completely unambiguous term, whereas tight is unambiguous. Tight specifically means small orb, very small orb. And as I said before, tight can depend on context. What if there are 4 or more planets involved in a planetary configuration? Well, what you're considering to be tight might be a little more liberal than if it's just 2 planets. Depends on context, exactly what the orb is going to be. And the astrologer. Each astrologer might have a slightly different tendency for cutoff points for what they consider to be very tight or fairly tight orbs. Now, a weak aspect or a weak midpoint structure. What does it mean when we say weak? interestingly, even though strong tends to be ambiguous, weak is less ambiguous than strong. When you say a midpoint structure is weak, it means it has a large orb, and there's nothing else going on to strengthen it, to highlight it. So for example, in VA, we typically allow a 1 degree 30-minute orb for midpoint structures. That's the maximum orb, 1.5 degrees. So if a midpoint structure is close to a 1.5 degree orb, like it's 1 degree 20 minutes, 1 degree 25 minutes, maybe even 1 degree 15 minutes, we'll often say, well, he has a weak, that midpoint structure is weak. Somewhere in that range. Okay. For a conjunction in a vibrational chart, suppose Sun is conjunct Jupiter in the 13 vibration chart, or 19 vibration chart, you get over about 10 degrees, it's getting pretty weak. Over 12 degrees typically is weak. Under 8 degrees is pretty solid. I mean, it's there. In a natal chart. 4 degrees getting fairly strong. 2 degrees is strong. Planets are conjunct within 2 or 3 years strong. I use the word tight. I'm fairly strict about it. I mean, you've got to be within a degree, maybe a degree and a half for me to call it anything tight, even a conjunction. So, I don't know, but some people may be a little, not so demanding for using that term. Okay, so that's the idea. These are terms that are not technically defined at some cutoff point, but they are still helpful, and there is a general overall consensus, and it gives you an idea. But certainly, if someone says, oh, he has a tight midpoint structure, and you look at the chart and you see that the orb is 1 degree 5 minutes, that is not tight. No, that is not tight. That astrologer is not using vibrational astrology. If they think they are, they're not using it very well, because you're already more than two-thirds of the way out to maximum orb. I mean, the maximum orb is only 1.5 degrees. Okay. So this is important, because sometimes beginners in vibrational astrology are not clear about what we mean by tight, and they start guessing what tight might mean, and they might start, saying things like a midpoint structure with a 1 degree orb is tight, because a 1 degree orb for an aspect would be very tight, and a conjunction in a vibrational chart, it would be tight, but not for a midpoint structure. It's relative to what the maximum orb is. Okay. All right, well, I'm talking a lot because I want to get into all these details clear in case they're not completely clear. And I found out for some people that they're not. Okay, I think I will pick up with this term in the third of the series of videos on terminology and notation, because we're alignment and aligned, because there's a specific planetary configuration where we use those terms. So let's pick up with this, because it ties into some later ideas. Let's pick up with this in the third video in this series on notation and terminology. Okay, and we're starting to get more advanced. So if you're already a professional level vibrational astrologer, and this has been a little bit slow, but hopefully just making everything clear, also helping you when you're trying to explain to somebody, if you're doing teaching, I think it's helpful to have all these guidelines clear. But now we're starting to head into the stuff that's newer and fresher and more specific and builds upon what we've discussed, more specific to the actual interpretation that we do with vibrational astrology. Okay, my friends, thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the next, the third video in this series. God bless. Namaste.